I'm interested to get your perspective on whether you think every country should open their borders. For example,
Mm-hmm.
countries like Japan
Mm-hmm.
or Bhutan or
Mm-hmm.
Israel, countries which have a relatively strong cultural ethnic identity. Do you think something would be lost if Japan opened its borders and within 50 years became, like the city of London, for example, very
Mm-hmm.
ethnically diverse with no
Mm-hmm.
single Japanese culture?
Yeah, I'd say something would be lost, but more would be gained. But again, I'm not dogmatic about this. So there are a few countries where I think that it would actually cause civil war. And and that is, I think, bad enough to say, all right, let's not do open borders then. That's
So
still one where I would say, all right, how much can we open them without getting a notable risk of civil war, or notably raising the risk of civil war? There's always some very slight base rate. Now,
does that mean that you're a consequentialist about open borders? Then there are circumstances where you think it's
yeah.
legitimate for the government to interfere in private transactions involving
Mm-hmm.
immigration.
So there's the technical name for my moral position is called weak deontology. This is where I'll say there's a moral presumption in favor of open borders, and even if there were not gains, then it would still be normally the right thing to do. But if the consequence is sufficiently bad, that is sufficient to outweigh it. So it's is it all right? Is it all right to steal a dime to save the world? Yes, of course, steal the dime. Obviously. Is it okay to tell a lie to go and prevent an axe murderer from killing the children? Classic one from Kant. On the supposed right to lie from an altruistic motive. Yes, lie to save children from axe murderers. Definitely. I'm not crazy on this. On the other hand, as our earlier discussion about the ethics of preventing people from having children suggests, it seems like you too have a moral presumption that it is a bad thing to stop a person from having children, even if we consistently predict their children are going to be, say, a burden on the welfare state. It seemed like you were limiting it to very rare cases.
Yes, I guess I subscribe to a sort of presumption in favor of liberty. I'm kind of conservatarian in that respect. But
right. Now, there is a group called Open Borders for Israel, which is really just a troll group. But it comes, they pretend to be Israelis who want to open Israeli borders, but they're actually anti-Semites who just want to go and make fun of Israel. My view there, so I am half Jewish, but I do not support Israel. I don't support any government. Governments do terrible things, and we should always be looking at them with skepticism, in my view. This is a case where I just think that the evidence that open borders would lead to civil war in Israel is very strong. And how strong? Well, Jordan did it, and they almost had civil war. Lebanon did it, and they had civil war. So I think it's a fair bet that Israel would as well. But in terms of just preserving the culture, things like, should Israel let in Christian Russians? Then absolutely. And this idea that it's our right to go and keep the culture the way that it is it really is a totalitarian idea. The way that I think about it is, so my dad's 85, Noah. How do you think he feels about modern American culture? Just using your knowledge of sociology to predict my father's feelings about
not wholly favorable towards it.
Not wholly favorable. That's correct, right? And I'm going to go further and say, how does he feel about me and my cultural attitudes? I'm his own son.
But if we return to the case,
not thrilled. Now, what would have been necessary for my parents' generation to preserve their culture? It really would have been a totalitarian system that would be necessary. They'd have to keep people, so when I was 16, I stopped going to Catholic church. All right. Very disappointing to my mom. What would have been necessary for her to go and preserve her culture? You'd have to go and take away my freedom of religion. And here's the thing. You might say, well, it's a specious analogy, but I think the main thing is that, if you just ask people, who do you feel more culturally in sync with? Immigrants your own age or natives of your parents' age?
No, it's a valid question, but I think a lot of the immigration skeptics would not be inconsistent in this regard. They would lament many of the cultural changes.
But not to the point where they would want to deprive young people of the freedom to have their own religion and their own music and art that they like. And
no. I suppose they would dispute that,
even their own family structures. There are people definitely strong enough to go and say, let me put it this way: there's people who say things we went too far with legalizing gay marriage. It's pretty hard to meet someone who says we should have just kept being gay illegal, and that way we could have prevented the breakdown of the family or something like that, which seems
Yeah, well, I think that
fanciful anyway. But I mean,
a lot of conservatives put emphasis, not unreasonably, on the relaxation of divorce laws and breakdown of the family. And I think there you can make
know
a
better
relatively
people
good
than
case.
I know, Noah. I mean, sort of the standard thing in the U.S. really is for conservatives to never talk about divorce because guess what? A lot of divorced people vote for them, so they shut up. Whereas they do complain a lot about LGBT because they're not losing any votes from that, and they're not in their group, so it's just a lot more comfortable. Whereas, say, obviously, there's a lot more kids that have suffered from their parents' divorce than have suffered from gay marriage. Right, but
no, I mean,
but anyway, like I envy the people you're talking, the people you talk to, Noah. They just seem better than the ones that I talk to.
Your point about generational cultural changes, I think, is valid. But I understand that you went on a trip to Japan not too long ago, and you really enjoyed many aspects of Japanese culture, as many tourists in that country do. It just wouldn't, but it wouldn't be the same society if it had open borders 20 years later, would it? There wouldn't really be much point in going to Japan because it would have the same culture as every other country with open borders, approximately.
I'd say there'd still be enormous points. Like I like going to England, right? And you might say England is similar to other Western so other Europe, like other English-speaking metropolises. So like it would still be quite different. Like a lot of it would be going on is that there would be a lot of foreigners assimilating to Japanese culture. So we would get to see that. We'd see fusionism. It would be different. Well, let me actually tell you this. So my mom actually worked in Japan right after World War II as a secretary for the Air Force. And in the 90s, I asked her, would you be interested in going with me to Japan? And she said, oh, no, I think it's probably changed a lot. And when I heard this, like, that's why you would want to go now. That's what would make it so incredibly fascinating, I would assume. But no, she didn't want to see it different. And to me, this was just a bizarre mentality, definitely for a tourist, but also for someone that actually lives there full time. It's like, well, yes, there's change, and you do lose things when there's change, but there's also a whole lot of incredible improvements. I mean, I think it would be fascinating if we could go, if young people today could go back in a time machine and tour around the 1980s of my youth, and I would pay crazy amount just to go there and just see it again. But this doesn't mean that I think that things were better in the 80s. I think it's really great that the 80s are no longer here and we've moved on. And there's things that I think are worse. Of course, I'm not blind, Noah, but there's so many things that are better and amazing. That's what I would say about Japan.
You do accept that there are some categories of immigrant that can be legitimately excluded? I think terrorists and criminals. Is that right?
So, I mean, again, like I would even go further and say, like, is it going to are they going to cause a civil war? And then it's like, well, what does that mean? Like, how about if their presence is going to raise the probability of civil war up by 1 or 2 percentage points? That's where I say, well, how many people are we talking? If there's 50 people that are going to raise your odds by 1 percentage point, like that, those seem like really dangerous people. Keep them out. And so they're not terrorists, they're nice people. It's just that their presence will upset some other people that will something.
But if we're talking about, for example, the United States, you would accept that it makes sense to keep out people who are members of Al Qaeda and so on.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that if they're applying for immigration, why not say come and then arrest them when they show up?
Well, that, yeah.
I would say that would be the most sensible thing, but if they're that dumb.
The way that some immigration skeptics would look at the problem is, yes, of course we should prevent people who are members of Al Qaeda from entering the country, but there are categories of immigrant who one can discern from correlations in the data that exist to have much higher probabilities of becoming criminals or of engaging in crime once they're here, once they've settled here. So why not exclude them before they've immigrated? Or why not extend the logic a little bit further to probabilities of becoming criminal?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's totally reasonable as long as you, first of all, actually do the math, because that's one where to say they have a higher probability, so let's keep them out. It's like, well, hold on, how much higher? And furthermore, are we keeping in mind the thing that we talked about in the first 5 or 10 minutes, Noah, where we said, well, yes, but if he's not a criminal, there's going to be a gain to humanity of a couple $1 million over this person's lifetime. And then we go and compare this to there is a, say 2% chance that they wind up being in jail, and that they, there's the harm of the crime, there's the cost of incarcerating them. And is that plausibly anywhere close to $1 million?